What if everything you believed about the universe, its origins, its purpose, even your own existence, what if it was radically different from what you currently assume?
It's a huge question.
Does God exist? Or is belief maybe just a human invention, a profound reflection, perhaps, of our own minds? This is the kind of fundamental question we try to unravel here on RealTime Affairs.
And it's a question that, well, it's echoed through history, hasn't it? It shaped entire civilizations, defined countless personal journeys. It remains one of humanity's biggest inquiries.
Absolutely.
So today, we're not just, scratching the surface, we're diving deep, right into the core of this timeless question.
Get ready for a really balanced exploration. We're looking at arguments, counter-arguments, and some surprising ways science, philosophy, and even personal experience intersect on this question. Does God exist?
Yeah, we've gathered a stack of sources, everything from ancient philosophy right up to cutting-edge cosmology.
The goal here is to give you, the listener, a shortcut, a way to get well-informed without getting totally overwhelmed. So stay with us for a deep, balanced dive that hopefully promises to challenge and inform. All right, let's unpack this then. For centuries, thinkers have constructed these really intricate arguments for God's existence, often starting by looking at the universe itself.
That's right.
We're going to explore some of the most prominent ones, maybe starting with what philosophers often call the cosmological argument.
Yes, the cosmological argument, its core idea is, well, it's actually quite intuitive when you break it down. It proposes that the universe, and really everything in it, is contingent.
Contingent. Okay, what does that mean exactly in this context?
It means something that didn't have to exist. It could have failed to exist. Think about, well, your coffee cup, or even yourself. You exist, but you could easily not have.
Right. My existence isn't necessary in some grand cosmic sense.
Exactly. And a contingent thing, by its very nature, doesn't explain its own existence. It needs an explanation or, a cause outside of itself. So the argument goes that this chain of explanations, this thing caused by that thing, caused by another thing, it can't just go on infinitely backwards.
Why not?
Well, if it did, you'd never actually arrive at a final explanation. It would be explanations all the way down, so to speak. So it must ultimately lead to something that is non-contingent, something that must exist, a necessary being.
And that necessary being
is typically identified as God. The uncaused cause, the ultimate reality that explains everything else.
That makes a certain kind of intuitive sense. It's a bit like finding a really complex ancient ruin deep in a jungle no one's ever explored. You wouldn't just assume it spontaneously popped into existence from, well, nothing, right?
No, absolutely not.
You'd immediately start looking for explanation. Who built it? Why? How did it get there?
Precisely.
And the universe, in all its vastness and complexity, is obviously much bigger than a ruin. But the principle, for proponents of this argument, feels similar. Contingent things need explaining.
Exactly. Philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, way back, formalized this fundamental need for a sufficient cause. He looked at things like objects in motion.
Right, something had to start the motion.
Exactly, or things that were caused to come into being, or these contingent beings that might not have existed. Aquinas saw this universal principle, and much more recently, Richard Swinburne applied this same principle to the universe as a whole.
How did he frame it?
He calls the entire universe, with all its contingent facts and phenomena, the big conjunctive contingent fact.
Wow, okay. That's a mouthful.
It is, but it captures the idea. It's this huge collection of things, all of which could have been otherwise. A massive contingent reality. And just like any other contingent facts, Swinburne argues, it demands an explanation beyond itself.
Okay, so that's the broad idea.
Yeah.
But within that, there's a specific version often debated, right? The Kalam cosmological argument.
Yes, the Kalam version. It's very prominent, especially in contemporary discussions. It specifically argues for a temporal beginning of the universe.
A beginning in time.
Right. And it starts with what seems like a very straightforward, almost obvious premise. Premise one. Whatever begins to exist has a cause.
That feels hard to argue with in everyday life. Things don't just pop into being.
It's often considered self-evident, yeah. Reflects a deep intuition. As the philosopher William Lane Craig puts it quite forcefully, no one sincerely believes that things, say, a horse or an Eskimo village, can just pop into being without a cause.
Right, you'd think they were joking or, well, mistaken.
Exactly. We see causality everywhere. Things don't just spring into existence uncaused. So that premise grounds the argument in common sense, or at least common experience.
Okay, premise one.
Yeah.
Whatever begins to exist has a cause. What's premise 2?
Premise 2 is where it gets really interesting and where science comes in quite heavily. Premise 2 is the universe began to exist.
So not just contingent, but actually had a starting point.
Precisely. And this isn't just a philosophical assumption anymore. It draws very heavily on modern scientific evidence, specifically from cosmology.
The Big Bang.
Exactly. The prevailing Big Bang theory strongly suggests an absolute beginning for our universe around, 13.7 billion years ago?
And scientists talk about this not just as a rearrangement of existing stuff, right?
That's key. Physicist P.C.W. Davies explains it's not just imposing organization on some prior state, but literally the coming into being of all physical things from nothing. Space, time, matter, energy, everything.
From nothing. Which sounds very much like beginning to exist.
It points strongly towards a singular moment of origin, rather than, say, an eternally existing static universe.
And isn't there a mathematical proof that supports this idea of a beginning too? Something from the early 2000s.
Ah, yes, you're thinking of the Bordguth-Vilenkin theorem, published in 2003.
That's the one. What does it say?
It's quite profound, actually. It states that any universe that is, on average, in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be eternal in the past. It must have had an absolute beginning.
Any universe.
Yeah.
Even if ours is part of a multiverse.
That's the striping part. The theorem applies even under multiverse scenarios. If the wider multiverse itself is expanding on average, it too must have had a beginning. It points towards an ultimate origin beyond any individual universe or even a collection of them.
Wow. Okay, so scientific evidence points towards a beginning. Are there philosophical arguments for it too? You mentioned something about infinity earlier.
Yes, there's a philosophical argument against the possibility of an actual infinite number of past events.
An actual infinite, as opposed to?
As opposed to a potential infinite, which is like series that can always be added to but is never actually complete. An actual infinite would be a completed, existing infinite set, like an infinite number of past moments that have already occurred.
And why is that considered impossible in reality?
Well, Craig argues it leads to logical absurdities if applied to the real world. He uses thought experiments, like Hilbert's Hotel, or his library with an infinite number of books, paradox.
How does the library paradox work?
Imagine a library with an actually infinite number of books, and say it has an infinite number of red books and an infinite number of black books.
Okay. Seems strange, but conceptually.
Right. But then the number of red books, infinite, would be equal to the total number of books, infinite. Or you could remove all the red books, and the number of books remaining would still be infinite, the same size.
That does feel deeply counterintuitive.
It leads to these kinds of paradoxes. Craig argues these show that while the idea of an actual infinite is fine in mathematics, it can't exist in concrete reality. You can't traverse an actually infinite series of past events to reach the present.
So if an actual infinite series of past events is impossible,
then the series of past events must be finite, which means the universe must have had a beginning.
Okay, so putting the Coulomb argument together. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist, supported by science and philosophy.
Therefore, the conclusion follows, the universe has a cause beyond itself.
And that cause, given it created the entire cosmos.
Proponents argue, must be incredibly powerful, timeless, immaterial, and likely personal and intelligent to choose to create, which again points towards the concept of God.
Makes sense as a line of reasoning. Now let's shift gears slightly to another classical argument, one that focuses not just on existence, but on the nature of that existence. The teleological argument, right? The argument from design.
Yes, exactly. This one appeals to the intricate order, the complexity, and the apparent purpose or function we observe all around us.
It feels very intuitive, looking at, say, the complexity of an eye or a bird's wing.
It does. The core idea is that the universe exhibits such specific functionality, such delicate complexity and fine-tuning, that it suggests an intelligent designer rather than just emerging from blind chance or rigid necessity.
You mentioned fine-tuning. That seems to be a really powerful aspect of this argument in modern cosmology.
It really is. This concept of cosmic fine-tuning is quite striking. What scientists have discovered is that the fundamental physical constants and quantities of the universe—
things like gravity, the electromagnetic force.
Exactly. Those fundamental forces, the initial conditions of the Big Bang, the ratio of particle masses, they all fall within an extraordinarily narrow range. A range that's absolutely necessary for life, any kind of complex life, to exist.
And if they were just slightly different?
Even slightly, the universe would be drastically different and almost certainly lifeless. Stars might not form, or they'd burn out too quickly. Chemistry as we know it might be impossible. Atoms might not even be stable.
Give me an example. How fine-tuned are we talking?
Well, take the atomic weak force. If its value were altered by as little as 1 part in 10 to the power of 100.
That's a 1 followed by 100 zeros.
Yes, an unimaginably tiny change. If it were different by just that much, life as we know it simply wouldn't exist. It's like trying to hit a target the size of a single atom from clear across the known universe, blindfolded.
Wow. The odds against that happening by just random chance seem
Incomprehensibly great, that's the phrase often used. Just staggeringly improbable.
So, if it's that improbable, what are the alternative explanations proponents consider besides design?
The two main contenders are usually physical necessity or chance.
Physical necessity meaning the universe had to be this way. These constants couldn't have been different.
Right, but that's largely ruled out by modern physics, actually. Theories like string theory, for example, predict a vast cosmic landscape of possible universes. Maybe 10 to the power of 500 different possible sets of physical laws and constants.
10 to the 500. That's even more zeros.
It's a staggering number. And the crucial point is, the overwhelming majority of these theoretically possible universes would be completely life-prohibiting. So our life-permitting universe doesn't look like it was physically necessary. It's just one possibility among countless others.
Okay, so if it's not necessary, then we're back to chance. It just happened to turn out this way against all odds.
That's the other possibility. But given how incredibly narrow the life-permitting range is compared to the vast number of life-prohibiting possibilities, the chance explanation also seems fantastically improbable to many people. It strains credulity.
So if it's highly unlikely to be necessity and highly unlikely to be chance,
then design emerges, for proponents, as the best explanation. It's an inference to the best explanation, a common form of reasoning.
Richard Swinburne makes this point too, right? About comprehensibility.
He does. He argues that while you could just accept the universe's existence and its fine-tuning as a brute fact, something that just is, with no further explanation.
Which feels a bit unsatisfying scientifically, maybe.
Well, Swinburne argues it fails to accord with the example of the sciences, which seek the best explanation. He suggests that assuming it was brought about by a personal God with intentional beliefs and the power to bring intentions to fruition makes the universe comprehensible in a way that brute fact doesn't.
And he uses probability theory, Bayesian analysis.
Yes, he employs Bayesian reasoning. He argues that the simplicity of a single ultimate divine mind as an explanation compared to the sheer intricate complexity of the universe itself actually gives the design hypothesis a higher prior probability. It's an argument for elegance and explanatory power.
Interesting. Okay, moving from the physical universe to pure logic. The ontological argument. This one feels different, very abstract.
It is very different. It's an a priori argument, meaning it doesn't rely on observing the world. It argues for God's existence purely from the concept of God.
How does that work?
The core idea, going back to Anselm and refined by philosophers like Alvin Plantinga, is to define God as a maximally great being, a being than which no greater can possibly be conceived.
Okay, the greatest possible being.
Right. Now, Plantinga's modal ontological argument, which is probably the most discussed version today, uses the logic of possibility and necessity. It suggests that if a maximally great being, one possessing omnipotence, omniscience, perfect goodness, and necessary existence to the highest degree, is even logically possible.
If the concept itself isn't contradictory, like a square circle.
Exactly. If the concept is coherent, then such a being must exist in all possible worlds. And if it exists in all possible worlds, then it must exist in the actual world.
So, if it's possible, it's actual. That feels like a leap.
It does feel like a leap. The argument hinges on the idea that necessary existence, existing in all possible worlds, is part of what makes a being maximally great. A being that existed only contingently wouldn't be as great as one that existed necessarily.
So if maximal greatness is possible, it must include necessary existence, which means it must exist.
That's the logic. Most philosophers actually agree on the conditional part. If God's existence as a maximally great being is even possible, then God must exist necessarily.
So the whole debate boils down to whether that concept of a maximally great being is actually possible. Is it coherent?
Precisely. That's the crucial point of contention. Is the concept logically consistent? Or does it contain hidden contradictions, like the idea of a married bachelor? If the concept holds together, the argument claims existence follows.
Fascinating, if a bit mind-bending. Let's move to an argument that feels maybe more grounded in our everyday lives. The moral argument. This connects God to our sense of right and wrong.
Yes, this argument suggests that the existence of objective moral values and duties points towards a divine source or foundation.
Objective morality, meaning morals aren't just opinions or cultural preferences.
Exactly. To say something is objectively wrong, like the standard example is the Holocaust, or torturing children for fun, it means it's wrong independent of people's opinions. It would still be wrong even if literally everyone believed it was right.
And most people, intuitively, feel that some things are objectively wrong, don't they? We act as if things like compassion, justice, fairness have real weight beyond just personal feelings.
We do. You might find yourself deeply committed to ideas like tolerance or love being objectively valid, not just useful strategies. But the argument then asks, where do these objective standards come from?
If there's no transcendent basis, no source beyond human agreement or evolution,
then it's hard to see how they could be truly objective. William Lane Craig puts the argument very directly. Premise 1, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist.
which many people deeply believe.
Right. Conclusion, therefore, God exists.
What about the Euthyphro dilemma? Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's already good?
Ah, the classic challenge. If it's good because God commands it, morality seems arbitrary. If God commands it because it's good, then goodness exists independently of God.
So how do proponents address that?
Philosophers like Robert Adams suggest a third way. They argue that God's commands aren't arbitrary, but necessarily reflect God's own essentially good nature. Goodness is grounded in God's character, so God commands what is good because God is good.
Okay, that tries to resolve the dilemma. This also seems connected to the idea of human dignity, doesn't it? That inherent value we feel people possess.
It does. The argument from human dignity suggests that humans possess this special kind of intrinsic value, dignity, that transcends our utility or capabilities.
And the argument is that this dignity is best explained
By human beings being created by a supremely good God in God's own image. The argument challenges purely naturalistic explanations to account for this seemingly intrinsic equal worth, especially when considering, say, infants or those with severe cognitive impairments who might lack the rational capacities often cited in secular accounts of dignity.
It's a tough challenge for naturalism. What about Kant's version of the moral argument? It seems slightly different.
Kant's argument is more about the requirements of morality itself. He argued that morality requires us to strive for the highest good, a state where virtue and happiness are perfectly aligned.
Okay.
And he believed ought implies can. If we ought to strive for this, it must be achievable. But looking at the world rationally, it seems unlikely that virtue always leads to happiness in this life, or that we can achieve perfect virtue on our own.
So the world doesn't seem set up to guarantee the highest good.
Right. So Kant argued, to make sense of our absolute moral obligations, we must postulate the existence of God as a being who can ensure that the highest good is ultimately attainable, harmonizing morality with reality. Henry Sidgwick made a similar point about the dualism of practical reason. Morality demands self-sacrifice, while we naturally seek happiness. Only God, he thought, could resolve this tension.
Okay, so we've covered quite a few arguments for God's existence, based on cosmology, design, logic, morality.
Right.
But now we need to look at the other side. What are the compelling arguments put forward by those who question or reject theism?
Right.
On the flip side, atheism isn't simply a lack of belief for many. It's often supported by its own lines of reasoning, including critiques of those very classical arguments we just laid out.
Absolutely. Let's take the cosmological argument again. Critics have pushed back hard. David Hume, centuries ago, famously questioned whether we can really know that everything must have a cause, especially something unique like the universe. Can we extrapolate from causes within the universe to a cause of the universe?
He doubted the principle of causation itself, in a way.
He questioned our basis for assuming necessary connections between events. And Immanuel Kant also criticized the cosmological argument, arguing it ultimately sneaks in assumptions from the ontological argument to get to a necessary being, which he found flawed.
And more modern critics, like J.J.C. Smart.
Positivists, like Smart, argued that existence claims are fundamentally empirical, not logical. Saying God necessarily exists is, for them, a misuse of language. You can't define something into necessary existence. Necessity applies to logic and definitions, not to whether things actually exist in the world.
What about that taxicab fallacy you mentioned? The idea that the argument exempts God from needing a cause.
Yeah, critics say if everything needs an explanation, why does the rule suddenly stop applying when you get to God? It seems arbitrary, like dismissing a taxi once it's gotten you where you want to go.
How do the theists respond to that specific charge?
They typically argue that the principle isn't everything has a cause, but rather everything that begins to exist has a cause in the Kalam version, or every contingent thing has an explanation. God, conceived as a necessary, uncaused, eternal being, wouldn't fall under those categories. They also argue the atheist assumes the universe is the ultimate reality, thus begging the question against a necessary being outside it.
Okay, and the critiques of the Kalam argument specifically, like the infinite series idea.
Right. While Craig argues actual infinites lead to paradoxes in reality, critics like Bede Rundle say, well, those aren't really paradoxes, they're just the defining characteristics of infinite sets. Infinite sets behave differently from finite ones. Applying finite intuitions to them is the mistake, not the concept of infinity itself.
So mathematicians are perfectly comfortable with these properties of infinity.
Generally, yes. Also, the reliance of the Kalam argument on a specific view of time, the A view, where time flows, is contentious. If a B view of time is correct, where all moments exist timelessly, like points on a line, then the argument about traversing past events might not work in the same way.
And the challenge from quantum physics. The idea that maybe not everything does have a cause at the most fundamental level.
That's another significant challenge. Quantum mechanics seems to suggest that events like virtual particle pair production in a vacuum or radioactive decay might occur without a specific determining cause, only probabilities. If the causal principle isn't strictly universal,
Then the first premise of the Kalam argument is weakened.
potentially yes. It raises questions about whether we can apply macroscopic causality principles to the very beginning of the universe.
Okay, what about critiques of the design argument? Richard Dawkins is famously critical here, arguing God isn't a simpler explanation.
Right. Dawkins argues that any God capable of designing and fine-tuning a universe would have to be incredibly complex, far more complex than the universe itself. So, invoking God doesn't actually solve the problem of complexity, it just pushes it back a step to an even bigger complexity. Who designed the designer is his famous retort.
But theists have a counter to that, don't they, about the nature of mind?
They do. They argue Dawkins confuses the complexity of God's thoughts or actions with the simplicity of God's being. A pure mind or consciousness, unbound by physical parts or structure, could be considered metaphysically simple, even if its capacities are immense. Simplicity here refers to the nature of the entity itself, not the complexity of what it can do.
All right, let's turn to the ontological argument critiques. The main one is often summed up as,
Existence is not a predicate, attributed largely to Kant and echoed by Smart. The idea is that saying something exists doesn't add a property or quality to its concept, like saying it's powerful or good. It just states that the concept is instantiated in reality.
so adding existence to the definition of a perfect being doesn't actually make the concept greater, it just asserts the being is real.
Exactly. It's a claim about reality, not just an analysis of a concept. Furthermore, critics question the coherence of the concept of God itself. Can a being be truly omnipotent without contradiction? The stone paradox, can God create a stone so heavy he can't lift it, is a classic example.
How do theists usually handle the stone paradox?
Often by clarifying omnipotence. It doesn't mean ability to do the logically impossible. Creating a stone an omnipotent being cannot lift might be seen as a logical contradiction, like creating a square circle. So it's not a limit on God's power, just a limit of logic itself. Similar issues arise with omniscience knowing future free choices, knowing indexical claims like I am here now, or potential paradoxes from set theory applied to knowledge.
And we can't forget Ganilo's perfect island parody of Anselm's original argument.
Right. Ganilo argued, if Anselm's logic works, you could conceive of the most perfect possible island, and since existence is a perfection, that island must exist. It was meant to show the argument form could prove absurd things.
And the response.
The typical response is that an island, or any physical contingent thing, cannot possess maximal greatness in the same way as God. An island's perfection is limited and relative. It doesn't have necessary existence built into its concept like a maximally great being supposedly does.
Okay, moving beyond critiques of the classical arguments, there's a very powerful argument from the world, specifically from human experience.
Yeah.
The argument from non-belief, or divine hiddenness.
Yes, this argument, most prominently formulated by J.L. Schellenberg, hits hard for many people. It starts with the idea of a perfectly loving God.
If such a God exists.
Then Schellenberg argues reasonable non-belief should not occur. That is, people who are not culpably resisting God, who are genuinely open and seeking, should not fail to find sufficient grounds for belief.
Why? Because a loving God would want a relationship.
Exactly. A loving God would surely want a conscious, personal relationship with all creatures capable of it, and such a relationship presupposes belief in God's existence. If God desires this relationship and could make his existence clear enough for belief without overriding freedom, why wouldn't he?
But reasonable non-belief does seem to occur. There are sincere seekers who just don't find the evidence compelling.
Precisely. So Schellenberg concludes, since reasonable non-belief does occur, a perfectly loving God, as typically conceived, does not exist.
He uses that parable, doesn't he? The child lost in the rainforest.
Yes, the amnesiac child calling for a mother who could easily reveal herself but chooses not to. It's a powerful emotional analogy for the experience of feeling abandoned or unheard by a God who is supposed to be loving and present.
How do theists respond to this challenge of divine hiddenness?
There are several lines of response. Some, like Daniel Howard Snyder, question Schellenberg's specific conception of God's love, suggesting maybe God is more like a dispassionate sage than an eager parent. Others, particularly in Calvinist traditions, might fall back on attributing all non-belief ultimately to human sinfulness or a lack of true benevolence, essentially denying that truly inculpable non-belief exists.
But that feels unsatisfying to many today, maybe even unfair to sincere non-believers.
It does, which leads to other responses. One is skeptical theism. This essentially argues that we humans are in no position to judge what reasons God might have for allowing non-belief.
Like the novice chess player analogy. We can't see the grandmaster's reasons.
Exactly. Our cognitive limitations prevent us from knowing the full picture. Maybe there are greater goods served by divine hiddenness that we just can't comprehend. It places the burden of proof back on the atheist to show that we should expect to understand God's reasons if God existed.
So maybe God has reasons we can't grasp. What else?
Another major response is the soul-making theodicy, associated with John Hick and Michael Murray. They argue that a world where God's existence isn't overwhelmingly obvious might be necessary for genuine human moral and spiritual development.
How so?
If God's presence were undeniable, like the sun in the sky, perhaps our freedom to choose the good, to develop virtues like faith and perseverance, would be compromised. We might obey out of overwhelming presence rather than free conviction. Hiddenness allows for what Hick calls epistemic distance, a space for genuine faith and growth.
But doesn't that run into problems? Didn't the apostles, according to the text, have pretty direct evidence of the resurrection? And didn't Satan know God existed yet still rebelled?
Those are excellent counterpoints. They challenge the idea that clear knowledge necessarily removes moral freedom or the possibility of rebellion. It suggests the relationship between knowledge, faith, and free will is perhaps more complex than the soul-making theodicy sometimes implies.
Okay. Beyond these specific arguments, how do atheists generally approach the question epistemologically? What's their stance on belief and justification?
Most contemporary atheists adopt an evidentialist stance. They argue that belief, especially in extraordinary claims like God's existence, should be proportioned to the evidence. They require positive reasons, arguments, data to justify belief.
And the presumption of atheism.
Popularized by Antony Flew, this argues that the default position should be non-belief or lack of belief until sufficient evidence for theism is provided. The onus of proof, Flew argued, lies squarely on the theist making the positive claim. It's atheism as the starting point, pending evidence.
And atheists might offer positive arguments against God too, right? Not just critiques.
Yes. We touched on deductive atheology, which tries to show God's existence is logically impossible due to contradictions in divine attributes, like omnipotence versus perfect goodness versus evil. If the concept is incoherent, the being can't exist.
And inductive atheology.
This uses probabilistic arguments. It looks at evidence in the world, like the sheer amount and types of suffering, the evidential problem of evil, the prevalence of non-belief we just discussed, or scientific findings in biology or cosmology, and argues these make God's existence highly improbable, even if not logically impossible.
Is there also a view that God talk is just meaningless?
Yes, that's atheistic non-cognitivism. It claims that statements about God don't actually assert facts and have no truth value. They aren't true or false. They might be expressions of emotion, commitments to a way of life, or something else entirely, but not claims about objective reality.
Like saying, go team, isn't true or false, it's expressing support.
Kind of like that, yes. However, it's important to note most self-described atheists are cognitivists. They think God exists as a factual claim, they just think it's a false one.
Finally, there are pragmatic arguments for atheism, reasons why not believing might be better.
Yes. Hume argued that theism, especially its corruptions, often leads to bad moral outcomes. Intolerance, persecution, focusing on monkish virtues instead of human flourishing. Richard Dawkins calls religion a virus of the mind, suggesting it's a harmful meme that spreads uncritically.
And Kahan's worst world argument seemed particularly interesting.
It is. Kahan argues that even if God did exist, the world might actually be worse for humans in some ways. Our intellectual quest for understanding could be limited by ultimate divine mystery. Our moral autonomy might be compromised by subordination to divine commands. And we'd lose all privacy under an omniscient days. These are arguments about the desirability of living in a theistic world versus a naturalistic one.
Okay, we've really dug into the philosophical arguments and counter-arguments now, but so much of this debate, for many people, isn't just about logic. It involves personal faith, experience, perhaps even claims of miracles. How does that fit in? Right. This is where it gets really interesting. It may be more personal for many listeners. Beyond these logical proofs and critiques, countless people point to direct personal experience, a deep subjective conviction, or even specific historical claims of divine intervention as their reasons for belief.
Absolutely. This brings us to the idea of immediate knowledge or experience of God. The belief that God can be known directly, not just inferred at the end of an argument.
Like knowing another person rather than knowing about them.
Exactly. John Hick described how people in the Bible seem to know God this way, not as an inferred entity, but as a dynamic will interacting with their own wills. God was an experienced reality for them, as real and impactful as the weather, giving significance to their lives.
And this ties into Alvin Plantinga's idea of properly basic beliefs, doesn't it?
It does. Plantinga argues that belief in God doesn't necessarily need argumentative support to be rational. It can be properly basic, grounded directly in experience, much like our belief in the external world or other minds.
We don't need a philosophical proof that the chair I'm sitting on is real to rationally believe it's real.
Precisely. We take it as basic, grounded in our perceptual experience. Plantinga suggests certain experience as feeling God's presence in nature, feeling forgiven, experiencing answered prayer, can function similarly for belief in God. It becomes appropriately grounded for that person.
So for someone who has such an experience, the belief is rational for them, even without a universal proof.
That's the idea. Plantinga even suggests that for those who genuinely seek God, God will make his existence evident to them in this direct way, and focusing too much on external proofs might even be a distraction from the potential for direct encounter.
Okay, besides personal, subjective experience, what about specific historical events claimed as evidence? The resurrection of Jesus seems central here for Christianity.
It is. The core claim is that the resurrection, if it actually happened, is a unique divine miracle, providing powerful public evidence for God's existence and action in the world.
And historians debate the evidence for this.
Yes. Some New Testament historians, looking purely at the historical data, argue there are certain facts that are very difficult to explain naturalistically. They often point to three key ones.
Which are?
1, the discovery of Jesus' empty tomb by his female followers. 2, the numerous reported post-mortem appearances of Jesus to various individuals and groups. And 3, the sudden radical origin of the disciples' belief in the resurrection.
Why is that last one so important?
Because these disciples were first-century Jews. Their existing beliefs ran strongly against the idea of an individual Messiah dying and rising before the general resurrection at the end of time. For them to suddenly believe this specific man rose and be willing to die for that belief requires a powerful explanation.
And the common alternative explanations, the disciples stole the body, Jesus just fainted on the cross.
Those hypotheses have been around since the beginning, but many contemporary scholars find them historically problematic and insufficient to explain all three facts together: the empty tomb, the appearances, and the origin of the belief.
So some historians conclude the best explanation is supernatural.
Some do. N.T. Wright, a prominent scholar, famously said, "That is why, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him." For him, the resurrection becomes the most historically plausible explanation for the data we have.
Okay, so we have direct experience and historical claims. What about pragmatic arguments? Reasons to believe that aren't about proof, but about benefits.
Yes, pragmatic arguments assert that believing in God is rational or beneficial. even if it doesn't strictly prove God exists.
Pascal's wager is the classic example, right? Bet on God because the potential payout is infinite.
It is. While maybe not a proof, Pascal argued it's the rational choice, given the stakes. If God exists, you gain infinite happiness. If not, you lose little. The potential gain vastly outweighs the potential loss, making belief the logical wager if the evidence is ambiguous.
And William James offered a different kind of pragmatic argument with his will to believe.
James pushed back against the strict evidentialism of thinkers like W.K. Clifford, who said it's always wrong to believe on insufficient evidence. James argued this overly cautious approach might cause us to miss out on vital truths, especially truths that require a leap of faith to access.
When is it okay to believe without proof, according to James?
When the choice represents a genuine option, that means it has to be leaving a real possibility for you. Momentous, important consequences hang on it, and forced. You can't avoid choosing one way or the other.
Like the choice to believe or not believe in God.
He argued it often is. And if the issue is also intellectually open, meaning the evidence isn't decisive either way, then James says our passional nature not only may, but must decide. We can legitimately risk error for a chance at truth and a vital good.
He also talked about dependent propositions, where faith helps create the fact.
Yes, like social trust. A community works only if people trust each other first. That initial trust helps bring about the cooperative reality. James suggested religious faith might work similarly. By believing in a responsive thou rather than just an indifferent it, we open the possibility for a relationship that couldn't exist otherwise. Faith can pave the way for the experience.
Interesting. Were there other pragmatic arguments Mill's license to hope?
Yes, surprisingly, J.S. Mill argued that where evidence is inconclusive, hope can properly flourish. Believing in a creator, even one of limited power, as Mill thought the design argument suggested, allows for a superstructure of hope that can make life pleasant and lovely.
And arguments about consolation and meaning?
Right. Thinkers like Beatty and Newman argued theistic belief provides deep consolation and satisfies fundamental existential needs for meaning, purpose, hope, cosmic security that are essential for human well-being. Craig argues forcefully that without God, life is ultimately objectively meaningless and leads to despair, whereas with God, life has ultimate meaning and allows for lasting happiness.
But this idea of choosing to believe, or acting as if you believe to gain benefits, doesn't that raise issues like self-deception? You mentioned doxastic voluntarism.
It does raise complex questions. Doxastic voluntarism is the view that we can choose our beliefs directly. But can we really? Belief seems more like something that happens to us based on evidence or experience.
And the problem of catching belief.
This points out that if you start acting as if you believe, going to church, praying, immersing yourself in the community, perhaps initially just to foster hope, you often do end up genuinely believing over time. The practices inculcate the belief.
So it's hard to just aim for the benefits of belief without actually getting the belief itself.
It seems difficult, yes, which raises questions. Is this self-deception? Or is it legitimate belief formation if the evidence is truly ambiguous? Philosophers debate whether this kind of belief adoption is epistemically virtuous or problematic.
These personal and pragmatic dimensions add so much complexity. It leads us right into another huge area: the relationship between science and religion, often portrayed as a battleground.
Yeah, this science versus religion debate is unavoidable. Can they coexist? Are they fundamentally at odds? We hear conflicting views all the time. What are the main models for how they relate?
Well, one very influential model was proposed by Stephen Jay Gould, NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria.
Magisteria, like realms of authority.
Exactly. Gould suggested science and religion have distinct domains where they hold authority. Science gets the empirical realm, facts about the natural world, how it works. Religion gets the realm of ultimate meaning and moral value.
So science asks how. Religion asks why. Keep them separate and there's no conflict.
That's the idea. Science deals with facts, religion deals with values. They shouldn't tread on each other's turf. But critics like Richard Dawkins find it completely unrealistic, don't they?
They do. Dawkins argues NOMA is wishful thinking. He contends that a universe with a supernatural presence would be a fundamentally and qualitatively different kind of universe from one without. The difference is, inescapably, a scientific difference.
Why scientific?
Because, he argues, Religions make existence claims about reality, claims about miracles, creation, divine intervention, and afterlife. These are claims about how the world is, and therefore they are fundamentally scientific claims, open to investigation. You can't just cordon religion off into a purely values category.
Which leads us straight into naturalism versus theism when explaining origins.
Right. Ontological naturalism is the worldview that says only physical entities and causes exist. Nothing supernatural. Proponents argue this is the most successful approach historically in science, replacing supernatural explanations with natural ones. They also point to principles like the conservation of energy, suggesting a physically closed system.
So, for a naturalist, the burden of proof is heavily on anyone claiming something non-physical exists.
Very heavily, yes. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
And how do these different worldviews explain the origin of the universe and life?
Well, naturalism points to the Big Bang roughly 13.7 billion years ago, Earth forming 4.6 billion years ago, and life arising through natural chemical processes about 4 billion years ago. The origin of the Big Bang itself is still debated, with hypotheses like quantum fluctuations, brain cosmology, or cyclic models being explored within a naturalistic framework.
And the theistic views.
Big Bang theism accepts the Big Bang but sees God as its cause. Intelligent design theism generally accepts an old universe and evolution, but argues God intervened or guided the process, especially regarding the origin and complexity of life. And then creationism, typically young Earth creationism, rejects the Big Bang and evolution, positing a recent direct creation by God a few thousand years ago.
A big sticking point is often evolution. Does Darwinian evolution, with its randomness, rule out divine guidance?
That's a major point of contention. Some atheists, and also some creationists, argue, yes, they see Darwinian natural selection based on random mutation and natural selection, and divine guidance as mutually exclusive hypotheses. If science explains it naturally, God isn't needed.
But is that how most theistic evolutionists see it?
No. The common theistic response is that this view misunderstands God's relationship to the world. It treats God as just one more cause within nature, competing with natural causes.
Instead of
seeing God as the creator and sustainer of the entire natural order, including the laws and processes that drive evolution. On this view, a natural explanation, like evolution, describes how God works. It doesn't replace God as the ultimate explanation for why there are laws and processes at all. A natural explanation doesn't preclude a theistic one. They can operate at different levels.
What about the randomness aspect? Doesn't random mutation contradict purpose?
It depends what you mean by random. In biology, random mutation means mutations don't occur in response to the organism's needs. They aren't directed towards adaptation by the organism itself. It doesn't necessarily mean they are uncaused or purposeless from a higher perspective.
So God could still work through these random events?
A theist could argue yes. God could set up the initial conditions and natural laws such that the random process of evolution unfolds towards particular intended outcomes. The randomness required by the scientific theory doesn't necessarily imply the whole process is ultimately unguided or without purpose from a divine perspective.
Okay. What about science and morality? Can science tell us what's right and wrong, as Sam Harris suggests?
Harris argues forcefully that it can, in principle. He grounds morality in the well-being of conscious creatures. Since science can investigate what contributes to or detracts from well-being, he argues science can determine objective moral truths.
So, studying the negative effects of, say, torture on well-being could scientifically demonstrate it's wrong.
That's his claim. He uses it to critique moral relativism and religious moralities he sees as detrimental to well-being. It's an attempt to build an objective, secular morality based on scientific understanding of human flourishing.
But are there critiques of that view?
Yes. Critics question whether well-being itself can be purely objectively defined and measured by science. More fundamentally, they ask the is-ought question. Even if science tells us what causes well-being, does it tell us why we ought to maximize it? And again, the issue of grounding inherent dignity or value, especially for non-rational beings, solely in scientifically measurable capacities, remains a challenge for some.
Finally, can religious claims themselves be tested scientifically, like intercessory prayer?
Non-believers often assert that specific religious claims with empirical consequences should be testable. If prayer is claimed to heal people physically, that's a testable hypothesis.
And studies have been done.
Yes, several major studies, including some funded by religious organizations, have looked at the efficacy of intercessory prayer for healing. According to critics like physicist Victor Stenger, the rigorous double-blind studies generally found no statistically significant effect.
So the results were negative from that perspective.
According to those analyses, yes. This approach insists that when religion makes claims about the physical world, it enters the realm of science and is subject to its methods of investigation.
We've covered a lot of ground where science and religion seem to intersect, sometimes clash, sometimes find ways to coexist. But what about the middle ground? What about uncertainty, agnosticism, and just acknowledging the limits of what we can know?
Right. So after exploring all these arguments, counter-arguments, scientific data, philosophical puzzles, what if you're left feeling uncertain, neither absolutely convinced nor utterly dismissive? That brings us to agnosticism.
And related stances. William Rowe, for example, talked about friendly atheism.
Friendly atheism, how does that work? It's an atheist position that, while concluding God probably doesn't exist, acknowledges that a theist could still be rational or justified in their belief.
So you can disagree without thinking the other person is irrational.
Exactly. Maybe they have different evidence, different experiences, different ways of weighing arguments. Rowe contrasted this with unfriendly atheism, which asserts anyone who believes in God is irrational. The friendly approach allows for more constructive dialogue.
It acknowledges a certain fallibility in our own reasoning.
It does. It recognizes the difficulty of the question. This ties into the broader question of the limits of human comprehension itself. Can we actually expect to fully explain everything?
Like a debate over the principle of sufficient reason, PSR.
Precisely. Some arguments for God rely on the PSR that everything contingent must have a full explanation. But philosophers like Peter van Inwagen argue the PSR itself might be false, or at least we have no good reason to accept it universally. Applying it to the totality of all contingent facts might lead to paradoxes.
So maybe some things just are brute facts.
That's a possibility seriously considered in philosophy. Richard Swinburne, though arguing for God, concedes that accepting the universe as a brute, inexplicable fact is logically possible. Some naturalists embrace this.
And even for theists, doesn't God's existence become a kind of brute fact? An unexplained explainer?
In a sense, yes. Theists often describe God as metaphysically necessary, meaning God could not exist. In that framework, God doesn't require an external explanation. But for an agnostic or atheist, why that should be the ultimate brute fact rather than the universe itself remains the core question. And as Kahane argued, maybe the existence of God would limit our ability to fully understand reality.
This brings us back to certainty and evidence.
Yes.
Christopher Hitchens famously demanded extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims.
Yes, his line was that claims like a divine power intervening in the world are so extraordinary that they require evidence far beyond the ordinary. And he argued the evidence presented simply wasn't extraordinary enough.
What about the saying, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence?
It's a common philosophical point. Just because we haven't found evidence for something doesn't automatically prove it doesn't exist. However, Hitchens expressed skepticism about applying this too readily here, given the stakes. The implications of God's existence are so profound.
So it raises the question, how long do you look for evidence before concluding something probably isn't there? Especially for something so significant. When does absence of evidence become relevant evidence of absence?
That's a fundamental epistemological question with no easy answer, especially when dealing with concepts that might, by definition, transcend easy empirical verification. It really highlights the difficulty of achieving absolute certainty on this topic.
We've certainly journeyed through a complex landscape. Arguments, counter-arguments, science, faith, the limits of knowing. So where does this leave us reflecting on this profound question? So after this deep dive, what does it all mean for you, the listener? We've touched on the cosmos, morality, consciousness, the very limits of our understanding. How does the question, does God exist, impact our view of the human condition, of meaning itself?
Well, the perspectives diverge sharply. From a theistic viewpoint, like William Lane Craig's, life without God is ultimately meaningless, valueless, and purposeless. He paints a picture of despair, where humanity is just a temporary spark doomed to oblivion, making all our achievements ultimately inconsequential.
A pretty bleak outlook if God doesn't exist.
From that perspective, yes. It leads him to argue belief in God is necessary for a truly meaningful and happy life.
But atheists like Hitchens strongly disagreed, right?
Yeah.
He didn't see meaninglessness as the only alternative.
No, Hitchens rejected the idea that purpose must come from a supernatural source. While acknowledging he'd be depressed if the specifics of certain religious claims were true, he argued meaning can be found subjectively in human relationships, knowledge, art, solidarity, striving for justice within a finite, naturalistic world. For him, the finite nature of life could even make it more precious.
And then there are those pragmatic arguments again, the God-shaped whole, the need for consolation and cosmic security.
Right. Pascal's idea, Newman's factory girl argument. These suggest humans have deep-seated existential needs that, for many, only theistic belief seems to satisfy fully, providing hope and a sense of ultimate belonging in the universe.
This also connects directly to morality and responsibility. Craig challenges atheism. Where do objective morals come from without God? Are they just evolutionary byproducts?
That's his challenge. Without a divine lawgiver, morality becomes subjective or just a useful social construct, lacking real objective grounding.
But Hitchens countered that he, as an atheist, could be just as moral, if not more so, than a believer without needing divine commands.
Yes, he argued for moral autonomy. And he turned the argument around, pointing to commands in religious texts that seem profoundly immoral by modern standards: genocide, slavery, punishments, and historical atrocities committed by religious believers. He argued morality must come from human reason and empathy, not divine authority, which can be unreliable or even harmful.
Which leaves us with that persistent question. If objective morality exists, what grounds it? And how do we navigate conflicting moral claims, whether religious or secular?
It remains a central tension in the debate.
So ultimately, this deep dive, I think, shows us that the question, does God exist, isn't heading towards a simple, universally accepted yes or no answer anytime soon.
Probably not. It's a journey, isn't it? Through philosophy, science, history, personal experience, challenging our deepest assumptions.
Maybe the value isn't solely in finding a definitive answer, if one is even possible for us, but in the process itself. In the asking, the exploring, the willingness to grapple with these ultimate questions.
Perhaps. Maybe the journey is the destination here. It forces us to confront what we mean by knowledge, by evidence, by meaning itself. And maybe embracing the open-ended nature of it all is part of understanding our place in the cosmos. It certainly leaves us asking, what really counts as proof or compelling evidence when we're dealing with concepts that might lie beyond our immediate empirical grasp?
A question to keep pondering. This has been the deep dive on Does God Exist? We really hope we've given you plenty to think about and maybe sparked some new avenues for your own exploration. This is RealTime Affairs. Subscribe now for more deep dives where we untangle life's most important questions. And please, leave a comment wherever you're listening. What do you believe? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And follow us wherever you get your podcasts.